A fun question I've seen thrown around plenty of times on the online history space is, who met the most American presidents? Compared to plenty of other countries, especially early on in its history, America has been in a unique position with its presidency because of the short-term nature of the job. The average American president served about 5.2 years, much shorter than the average of a country, say, with a monarch or a dictator. Even plenty of other major democracies don't have term limits on their heads of government, say for example Canada, where the average length of a prime ministership is about 6.6 years. Or Germany, where chancellors have served an average of 7.6 years. And yes, I know America didn't have term limits until 1951, but all but one of our presidents went along with George Washington's precedent of stepping down after 2 terms served. So this is all just a roundabout way of saying that because we've statistically had a relatively high number of heads of government in a relatively short amount of time, there are plenty of examples of people in history meeting a lot of presidents. In this video, I won't really be considering who met the most sitting presidents, although I will address it here and there. My criteria for meeting a president is just that it can be any president, past, present, or future, that our person came face to face with at some point during his or her life. So no, I'm not going to count Theodore Roosevelt as meeting Abraham Lincoln because he was in attendance at his funeral. So without further ado, let's try to answer the question of who met the most presidents in American history. The most common way I've seen this framed is, what American president met the most other American presidents? So let's try to answer that first. In terms of living presidents, our current one, Donald Trump, has met a total of 8. Nixon, Carter, Reagan, both Bushes, Clinton, Obama, and Biden. And no, I won't be including himself for anyone we'll talk about today, that's just silly. Joe Biden has got Trump beat with a total of 8 or 9. Nixon, Ford, Carter, Reagan, both Bushes, Clinton, Obama, and Trump. The reason I say 8 or 9 is because we don't have documentation of Biden ever meeting Nixon in person, but we do know for a fact that they spoke on the phone, so take that as you will. Biden was also about 30 feet away from Harry Truman once, pictured here when the former president drove through Scranton during a St. Patrick's Day parade. Not sure if you would count that as meeting him, I probably wouldn't, but sure, you can make the case that Biden has met up to 10 presidents, but he has only been truly face-to-face with 8. Despite Biden's eternally long career in politics, he cannot claim the title of living president who has met the most presidents. That actually belongs to Bill Clinton with a total of 10, all of which he truly met face-to-face. He met every president that Joe Biden did, plus John F. Kennedy, which I am going to count here unlike Biden and Truman because we've got a photo of the two up close and personal when Clinton was just 16 years old. Okay, that's great and all, but if we expand our search to all presidents in American history, living or dead, Clinton doesn't even come close. Herbert Hoover met 11 presidents during his lifetime, one more than Clinton, those being every president from Theodore Roosevelt, the 26th president, all the way up to Richard Nixon, the 37th, obviously excluding himself. We have photographs of every single one of these meetings, except for Roosevelt, but Hoover recounted their meeting in a 1925 letter. We technically don't have a picture of Lyndon B. Johnson and Herbert Hoover meeting face to face, but in this image from 1931, Johnson was working as a congressional aide and was less than 10 feet away from Hoover. I think it's safe to say that the two at least briefly interacted. I believe George Bush Sr. and Ronald Reagan have also tied Hoover's record of 11. Bush Sr. met every president from Eisenhower onwards except for JFK, who he very possibly could have met at some point, but there's no record of that happening. Reagan met Truman, Eisenhower, Johnson, Nixon, Ford, Carter, both Bushes, Clinton, Trump, and Biden for a total of 11. Nixon has everyone else we've discussed beat so far with a total of 12 or 13, depending if you count Biden or not, like I mentioned earlier. Hoover, Truman, Eisenhower, Kennedy, Johnson, Ford, Reagan, Carter, both Bushes, Clinton, Trump, and Biden, maybe. But enough beating around the bush. The United States president who I'm 99% confident met the most other presidents is John Quincy Adams. Quincy existed at a very interesting time in American history. Plenty of presidents, while he was politically active, served only one term, or in some cases, a fraction of a term. From Washington until Lincoln, the average president served just 4.75 years, compared to the average of 5.5 years for every president who served after Lincoln. The cycle of leadership was just objectively quicker for the first third of American history, and Quincy was placed smack dab in the middle of that era. We don't have photographs of Quincy with any of these presidents, so bear with me as I walk you through the logic here. He had a connection to the founding father era of presidents through his father, John Adams, the second president of the United States, who I think would be a safe bet for the first future president Quincy ever met. He had a deep admiration for George Washington, and even served as minister to the Netherlands during Washington's presidency, and later served in the administrations of Presidents Madison and Monroe, bringing the total up to 4. But we're just getting started. Quincy also had a deep admiration for Thomas Jefferson, his father's close friend, then political rival, then friend again. The two interacted plenty of times, and some have even described Thomas Jefferson as a mentor-type figure to Quincy. Quincy and Andrew Jackson also met plenty of times, running against each other for the presidency in both 1824 and 1828, and having an array of mutual connections in the political realm. President Martin Van Buren was also heavily involved politically during the same time Quincy was, and the two men came face to face on many occasions. One example example of this is an 1826 dinner during Quincy's presidency, where he invited Van Buren to the White House for a dinner where we have records of Van Buren accepting the invitation. He almost certainly met William Henry Harrison, who he endorsed for president in the 1840 election and shared many mutual connections within the Whig establishment. Harrison was even appointed as the ambassador to Colombia by Adams at the end of his presidential administration. It's extremely likely he met John Tyler as well, due to serving in the House of Representatives during Tyler's presidency and being one of the loudest voices of opposition to the president, frequently butting heads with him on policy matters. Okay, we're now at 9 presidents Adams has met, and Adams' time in the House of Representatives after his presidential term gives us the connections we need for the last few. Adams served from 1831 until his death in 1848. 11th President James K. Polk had served alongside Adams from 1831 to 1839. Adams was more than familiar with Polk by the time he became president, and the two men were not at all fond of each other. A president Adams was a fan of, however, was 13th President Millard Fillmore, who served alongside of him in the House of Representatives from 1833 to 1835, and again from 1837 to 1843. Fillmore was mentioned plenty of times in Adams' diary, and the two men had a close personal and professional relationship, even with Adams dying before Fillmore became president. Finally, we've got Franklin Pierce, James Buchanan, Abraham Lincoln, and Andrew Johnson, the 14th through 17th presidents who all served in the House at the same time that Adams did. There's no direct evidence of him meeting any of these 4 men, but let's break it down. Franklin Pierce would have also been in the House at the same time Adams was, specifically from 1833 to 1837. There's technically no record of the two meeting, but it's extremely likely that they did. I'm also uncertain about Quincy meeting Buchanan. I actually lied a minute ago when I said all of these men served in the House at the same time Adams did, because Buchanan's final term technically ended one day before Adams' first one began. But okay, both men were heavily involved in Washington politics for nearly 3 decades concurrently, and Buchanan really started making a name for himself as a politician during Quincy's presidency as a voice of opposition. Washington circles were pretty tight at the time. I would imagine that these two met at some point. John Quincy Adams and Abraham Lincoln served in the House together for only 3 months, but I think it's also highly likely the two met. Lincoln represented a very similar ideological faction of the Whigs to Adams, and we even know that Lincoln was present for Adams' death in the Capitol building. Yeah, during a debate regarding the Mexican-American War, Adams suffered a cerebral hemorrhage on the House floor, collapsed, and died 2 days later inside the Speaker's room. Finally, Andrew Johnson and John Quincy Adams simultaneously served in the House of Representatives from 1843 to 1848. Before you say it's a stretch that any 2 representatives would have met each other, remember, the House was only half the size it is today back then, and I don't think it's crazy to say that at one point you meet your colleague who's been regularly convening in the same room as you for 5 years. So if you're keeping track, we can say with relative certainty that John Quincy Adams met at least 14 other presidents: Washington, his father, John Adams, Jefferson, Madison, Monroe, Jackson, Van Buren, Harrison, Tyler, Polk, Fillmore, Pierce, Lincoln, and Johnson. Like I mentioned earlier, Buchanan is a coin flip. His total easily could have been 15, but we just have the weakest evidence on that one. You'll also notice I left off Zachary Taylor, who I doubt Adams ever met, but it's technically not impossible. Taylor was almost exclusively a military man for most of his life, and really only became a mainstream national political figure after the Whig National Convention in 1848, months after Adams had died. Either way, Adams beats Richard Nixon's 12. So there we have it, the president that met the most other presidents. But what if I told you that the person who met the most presidents in history was not actually a president themselves? If your life goal is to meet as many presidents as possible, a major cheat code is to not be elected president yourself, because you can't really meet yourself. Billy Graham is a name I've seen thrown around a lot in this conversation. For people closer to my age, you might not even know who Billy Graham is, but he was a relatively big deal throughout most of the second half of the 20th century. He was probably the most prominent figure in the modern American evangelical Christian movement, and in addition to his broadcast sermons and live tours, he served as a spiritual advisor from every American president from Truman to Obama, with varying degrees of influence based on which president he had an audience with. For example, Truman hated the guy. That makes 12 presidents, plus one more when you include Trump's attendance at his 95th birthday party in 2013. It's also fully possible that Graham met Biden. He did die before Biden's presidency, but Biden had been in politics for decades at that point, and we know for a fact Biden has met his son, Franklin Graham. When I told one of my friends I was making this video, his guess for who had met the most presidents was Queen Elizabeth II, which is a completely understandable answer. Similar to Billy Graham, she lived to be almost 100 years old and was elevated to a position of prominence relatively early on in life. She actually met with one more currently sitting president than Billy Graham, with a total of 13. Remember, Graham never met with Trump while he was in office. The first one she met with was Harry Truman, who had about a year left in his term when Elizabeth ascended to the throne in 1952. From there on out, she met every president after Truman with the exception of Lyndon B. Johnson. So it seems like the low to mid-teens would be the magic number for how many presidents a person could meet. John Quincy Adams probably met either 14 or 15, Billy Graham met 13, Queen Elizabeth met 13, and Richard Nixon met 13. That seems like about as high of a number as you'd realistically be able to go, right? Wrong. What if I told you there is one more person who has by far the best claim to meeting the most American presidents of anyone in history, and it's not even close? Someone that I'd imagine a good chunk of people watching this video have never even heard of. That person is none other than President Theodore Roosevelt's eldest daughter, Alice Roosevelt Longworth. She met 16 presidents, and get this, all while they were in office. Like some other people I've talked about today, longevity helped out Alice quite a bit. She lived to be 96 years old and was essentially meeting presidents left and right throughout every chapter of her life. I'll link below an article from a man named Carl Anthony, a presidential and first lady historian and author, who compiled a list of Alice's recollections of meeting each president, which was extremely useful for this section of the video. In her youth, her father, Theodore Roosevelt, was gaining prominence as a figure on the national political stage. This allowed her to meet President Benjamin Harrison, who she described as a gnarled, bearded gnome of a man, and President Grover Cleveland, who she described as a corpulent man who always seemed bruised or swollen. Yeah, she didn't always have the kindest words when talking about others. You'll especially see this later on. Anyways, she of course met William McKinley, who her father served as vice president for. She recounted McKinley as a man who had as much spine as a chocolate eclair. I promise you, I'm not making this up. She of course met her father and his successor, William Howard Taft. She had nicer words for Taft that still seem a bit backhanded, calling him a great big pink porpoise of a man who had a smile like a big saucepan of warm milk. It seems she was always fond of Taft and even advised her father against trying to get the Republican nomination from him in 1912. If you're keeping count, we're now up to 5. Alice had a fantastic analysis of the next president she met, Woodrow Wilson, when she said there was a sanctimonious quality about him which was frightfully annoying, and horrible man, we all said, chasing after women and then saying his prayers before leaping into bed with them. We actually have a photo of Alice with the next president she met, Warren Harding, who she recounted as not a bad man, he was just a slob. If you know anything about Calvin Coolidge, he was known as a man of few words, and Alice seemed to agree with this assessment. By this time, her husband, Nicholas Longworth, was elected Speaker of the House, and when recounting a dinner with Coolidge that Nicholas organized, Alice said, when Nick toasted the president, Coolidge said absolutely nothing, just sat there. After Coolidge came Herbert Hoover, who Alice took her daughter Paulina to meet the day before Hoover's successor, FDR, was inaugurated. She described Hoover as a rather depressed tortoise. She of course met FDR, her distant relative, who she seemingly had a shaky relationship with. On the one hand, she claimed, I liked Franklin rather more than the rest of the family did, but also emphasized that his presidency came between the two of them in a way that Alice felt was disloyal to her family. During the 1940 campaign, she even proclaimed publicly that she'd rather vote for Hitler than vote for Franklin for a third term. She was also first cousins with FDR's wife, Eleanor, who she seemed to admire a great deal. Harry Truman was the next president that Alice met, who she had few words for, saying, he seemed perfectly fine enough. He liked me for some reason. I didn't know him well, not at all. We have a photo of Alice and the following president, Dwight Eisenhower, at his inaugural ball in 1953. She seemed to be skeptical of Ike's intelligence, saying there were certainly no sparks there, and you could sometimes just watch him trying to find the right words and arranging them in his head, like Scrabble. She had somewhat of a fascination with the Kennedy family, with very high praise for JFK compared to many of the prior presidents that she met. She described him as irresistible and a lusty young man, a really likable creature. She also had a camaraderie with Jackie Kennedy, even after her husband's death, and Bobby Kennedy too. She was also fond of Lyndon B. Johnson, calling him an engaging rogue elephant of a man. She also knew the Nixon family for several decades, and seemed to view the Watergate scandal in a more sympathetic light compared to most at the time. The final president she met in her lifetime was Gerald Ford, who we can see pictured here along with Queen Elizabeth II. So that brings us all the way up to an astounding 16, and she was even close to meeting 17 with an invitation to the White House from Jimmy Carter. She was in her mid-90s at this point and decided not to attend because she believed Carter had disrespected her somehow. I couldn't find more details on this incident, but if anyone knows what happened there, please let me know. I'm not entirely sure how to feel about Alice Roosevelt Longworth. On the one hand, her comments about the presidents were absolutely hilarious and extremely entertaining to read compared to your usual biographical accounts. But on the other hand, I'm not sure whether she should just be considered a lighthearted jokester or more of a rude and entitled nepo baby who never outgrew her teenage rebellious phase. The Hitler comment especially warped my perception of her. Either way, she is an absolutely fascinating person to learn about and someone who I plan to further research in the future. So there we have it. Alice Roosevelt Longworth is the record holder of the person who has met the most presidents, and John Quincy Adams is the most likely claimant to the title of the president that met the most other presidents. Can you think of anyone else in American history who met a bunch of presidents, say 10 or more? If you want to learn more about Alice Roosevelt Longworth's opinions on each and every president she met, and first ladies too, I'd strongly suggest reading the article I linked. It's one of the more interesting bits of United States history I've learned in a while. Please be sure to check out some of my other presidents videos here on the channel if you enjoyed this one. This is the 4th out of 5 president related videos I'll be uploading in the month of October for President's Month here on the channel. Thank you all for watching. This is Bay State History signing off.